specific in saying he was hurt and disappointed by his father. Were you surprised by that?
Mm-hmm.
King Charles had been expecting pressure. He had been expecting tension. He had even been expecting another difficult family moment that would need to be handled behind polished doors and in carefully measured language. But what he was not expecting was a formal demand that struck at one of the most protected corners of royal life. Because Meghan had not simply asked to support a cause. She had not quietly suggested helping during a sensitive period. She had demanded access to a royal patronage bound to Catherine, protected by palace tradition, and tied not just to work, but to trust, continuity, and the late Queen's judgment. And what makes this so explosive is that the real issue is not the request alone. The real issue is what that request seemed to reveal about ambition, hierarchy, legitimacy, and the boundaries nobody inside that family is supposed to cross. If you enjoy these royal deep dives where we look past the headline and into the hidden power struggle underneath it, stay with me, because this story only gets more revealing the deeper you go. At first glance, some people might hear this and think it sounds technical. A patronage dispute, a paperwork clash, another palace misunderstanding wrapped in dramatic language. But that is exactly why this moment is so easy to underestimate. In royal life, titles are never just titles. Patronages are never just symbolic decorations. They are signals. They are marks of trust. They are declarations about who represents what, and who has been chosen to carry meaning on behalf of the crown. So when a demand is made for something that belongs to Catherine, especially something sealed by tradition and emotionally linked to the late Queen's wishes, the request immediately becomes bigger than administration. It becomes a test of who believes they are entitled to stand where. The moment the submission arrived, Charles apparently thought he was opening a proposal for cooperation. That would have made sense. A charitable partnership, a practical offer. Perhaps even one of those carefully phrased attempts to lower the temperature between two sides of a family that has spent years drifting from strain into open fracture. Instead, what greeted him was language that changed the atmosphere in the room. Not because it was loud, but because it was bold. The protected patronage at the center of the request was Catherine's. Not temporarily floating, not abandoned, not available. Catherine's. Yet the wording reportedly framed it as if it needed new stewardship, new reach, and stronger forward motion. The kind of language that does not simply suggest support, but quietly questions whether the current holder still deserves to remain at the center of it. That is where this stops being a charity conversation and starts becoming something much sharper. Because if you describe Catherine's role as if it is effectively vacant, then you are not just asking to help. You are redefining her position without her consent. And in this family, where so much depends on symbolism, that is not a small thing. That is not a harmless reframing. That is a challenge. Charles, of all people, would have understood the stakes instantly. He is not just a father caught between competing emotional worlds. He is also the monarch now responsible for preserving lines that were not drawn by accident. The late Queen did not hand out important roles lightly. When she placed confidence in someone, especially Catherine, it carried institutional meaning. It said something about stability, about endurance, about the future shape of the monarchy. So if Meghan's language suggested that Catherine's reduced public visibility had created an opening, Charles would have seen the danger immediately. Because once illness, family strain, or temporary absence can be used as evidence that a royal woman has become replaceable, then the monarchy begins sending a brutal message about what loyalty is worth. And that is what made this sting. Catherine had not stepped back because she had abandoned anything. She had stepped back because life had demanded it. Because human vulnerability does not stop existing just because someone lives inside palace walls. Yet according to the narrative forming around this request, that reduction in visibility was apparently being treated less like a pause and more like a weakness, less like a temporary burden and more like an opportunity for someone else to move in. That is why this landed so hard, not only politically but emotionally. William reportedly delivered the matter to Catherine in private, and you can imagine the shift in the room when she heard the word that had apparently been used around the role, vacant. Just that one word, cold, efficient, dismissive. In any ordinary setting, it might sound like routine language, but here it felt like a verdict, a suggestion that while Catherine was carefully rebuilding her strength, someone else had been studying the gap and measuring the distance between temporary absence and permanent replacement. And here's the thing, that kind of move does not only affect Catherine as a person, it affects what she represents. Catherine is not just William's wife or a senior royal with a polished public image. In the narrative of the modern monarchy, she has come to embody steadiness. She represents continuity without noise, duty without constant self-advertisement. She is often framed as the composed anchor in a family that has repeatedly struggled to contain its own emotional weather. So when someone appears to demand one of her protected roles, the challenge is not merely personal, it is symbolic. It is almost like saying the quiet center is no longer secure. What made the whole thing even more alarming was the suggestion that the request contained language drawn from restricted palace material. That changes everything. Because now this is not just a bold idea coming from outside. Now it looks structured, informed, shaped with knowledge that was never meant to leave certain internal circles. A dormant transfer clause, a continuity framework, technical rules about temporary stewardship. Those are not the kind of phrases you stumble across by accident. If that language really appeared in the submission, then Charles was no longer looking at a family overreach. He was looking at an organized attempt to push through a boundary, using the palace's own internal logic against itself. That is the point where fury makes sense, not theatrical fury. Not someone shouting across a hallway. Royal fury is colder than that. It is the moment the glasses come off, the silence lengthens, the room clears, and everyone suddenly understands that what looked like a difficult family request has now become a direct challenge to the crown's internal authority. Because beneath the formal paperwork stood three people carrying very different wounds. Catherine saw the patronage as a promise, something earned through years of serious work and reinforced by the late Queen's personal trust. Meghan, at least in this version of events, seems to have seen it through an entirely different lens, as proof of what had been denied to her, redirected away from her, or reserved for someone she believed the institution was always more comfortable protecting. And Charles stood between those realities, knowing that every delay, every cautious silence, every attempt to avoid choosing had only made the eventual choice more painful. That is why this story becomes so revealing when you pull back. It is not really only about who gets a role. It is about how two women have come to symbolize opposite emotional narratives inside the royal family. Catherine represents the woman who stayed, adapted, endured, and became more central through consistency. Meghan represents the woman who believed she could have brought something transformative, but came to see the palace as a structure that praised duty, while deciding in advance whose duty truly counted. Put those two narratives near the same institution, and eventually something was always going to ignite. The backstory matters here, because these tensions do not come out of nowhere. Catherine's public work, especially around children and early development, has long been presented as thoughtful, patient, and deeply personal. It was never sold as flashy. It was never built around spectacle. That actually made it more royal, not less. It fit the monarchy's preferred language of service, calm, long-term, careful, and rooted in responsibility rather than self-branding. That style helped make her not just effective, but trusted. Meghan's approach to public life was always different, more global in tone, more assertive in messaging, more visibly modern in the way it linked causes to visibility, influence, and broader media energy. To some people that looked dynamic. To others, it looked like a model that sat awkwardly beside an institution still obsessed with restraint, hierarchy, and control. That difference in style matters because it shapes how each woman is perceived when questions of royal authority arise. Catherine can look like continuity. Meghan can look like disruption. And in a monarchy, disruption is rarely welcomed unless it arrives from the right bloodline. That is where the empty chair story becomes so important. Because apparently, this did not begin with one shocking letter. It began earlier, in a ceremonial setting where Catherine's absence was noted, but her place was preserved. That distinction is everything. An empty chair at a royal event can mean many things, but in this context it reportedly became an accidental symbol. To some it meant loyalty during difficulty. A quiet reminder that the role still belonged to the absent princess. But to others, or at least to someone prepared to read opportunity into absence, that chair may have looked like proof that the institution was protecting optics, while the role itself sat waiting for active leadership. And when one careless palace voice allegedly mentioned a continuity clause, the situation became combustible. Because now there was language to attach to the feeling. Now absence could be discussed not as a personal hardship, but as a structural opening. That is how royal trouble grows. Not always with dramatic declarations. sometimes with one private remark, repeated in the wrong circle, picked up by the wrong listener, and turned into strategy before anyone realizes what is happening. William, in this story, becomes more than Catherine's husband. He becomes the defender of the line, the future king who understands that what is being challenged is not just a role, but the principle behind it. If his wife can be quietly repositioned during a vulnerable period, then what exactly does royal loyalty protect? What does years of service secure? What does the monarchy mean when it says a role has been entrusted, if that trust can suddenly be questioned the moment someone more aggressive decides the spotlight should move? That is why he reportedly pushed back so hard. Because from his point of view, this was not a misunderstanding. It was not a warm offer poorly phrased. It was a reframing of Catherine's status. And once that becomes visible, it cannot be treated lightly. Especially not when the challenge seems to have been built using palace terminology that should never have traveled beyond protected channels. Camilla, interestingly, sits in a different place in this story. She would understand the politics of appearance perhaps better than most. A flat rejection of Meghan could easily be used to tell a public story about cruelty, exclusion, or a woman being blocked from helping children because palace egos mattered more than need. That is the trap. Approve the request and you wound Catherine. Reject the request and you risk feeding the narrative that Meghan is always frozen out. It is the kind of trap the royal family keeps walking into because they are always trying to defend both image and hierarchy at the same time, and sometimes those two instincts point in opposite directions. But here's where the emotional gravity shifts. Catherine, from everything described, did not want a public war. That matters, because it tells you something about her narrative function in this whole crisis. She is not written here as a competitor hungry to win. She is written as someone hurt by the implication, wounded by the timing, but unwilling to turn children, charities, or family pain into a spectacle. And that restraint makes the challenge look even harsher, because when one person is trying not to escalate and the other appears to be positioning for transfer, the moral contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The private confrontation between Charles and Meghan is where the whole thing fully hardens. No advisors, no staff performance, no glossy family language, just the demand and the people it affected. And what makes that scene so compelling is not just the clash, but the different philosophies apparently colliding inside it. Meghan's argument, if we follow the thread, was that the work mattered more than tradition, that global attention and modern reach could serve the cause better than palace caution. On one level, that is a strong argument. It sounds practical, contemporary, outcome-focused. But in royal life, outcome is never the only measure. Process matters, permission matters, symbolism matters, and above all, boundaries matter. So when Charles reportedly asked why Catherine had not been consulted before the filing, he was asking more than a procedural question. He was asking whether Meghan understood the basic principle she had crossed. You do not claim someone's entrusted role and then explain it to them afterward. Not in families, not in institutions, and certainly not in the monarchy. Then comes the line that seems to reveal the whole emotional wound under the strategy. The suggestion that Catherine's reduced activity had created the need for intervention. That is the moment this stops sounding noble and starts sounding personal. Because now the logic depends on Catherine's difficulty being reinterpreted as disqualification. And that is exactly why Charles would have reacted so sharply. Not just as king, but as a man who has seen how public pressure can distort private suffering inside his own family. When Catherine reportedly entered the conversation later, the power of the moment was not in a dramatic speech. It was in the simplicity of the question. Why had her work been described as abandoned instead of temporarily reduced? That question cuts through everything. It strips away the polished reasoning, the global framing, the strategic language, and forces the real issue into the room. Was this truly about helping? Or was it about reclassifying another woman's vulnerability as an opening? And that is when the story starts exposing something even deeper about the monarchy itself. This institution survives by telling the public that service matters, restraint matters, patience matters, and continuity matters. But if someone can attempt to leverage visibility, global branding, and pressure against those quieter virtues, then the monarchy has to decide what it actually believes. Does it reward steadiness, or does it bend to force? Does it protect trust, or does it surrender to whoever makes the most disruptive case? Princess Anne's role in the final phase is especially fitting, because Anne often symbolizes the old royal code in its purest form. no drama for performance, no patience for emotional manipulation dressed up as necessity. If she was the one reading the late Queen's private instruction aloud, then the moment becomes almost ceremonial in its own way, a line from one reign speaking into the next, a reminder that some things were settled not by popularity, not by media energy, but by judgment, memory, and very deliberate choice. And according to that interpretation, the late Queen had been clear. Illness did not void stewardship. Reduced appearances did not create vacancy. The role belonged to Catherine because of who she had shown herself to be, not because she happened to be publicly available every moment. That is devastating to Meghan's case because it destroys the very logic on which it seemed to rest. If absence does not equal surrender, then the role was never open. It was only being imagined as open by someone who needed it to be. That is why Charles's eventual refusal carries more than procedural force. It becomes a declaration about the values the monarchy still wants to pretend it lives by: loyalty over pressure, stewardship over ambition, continuity over disruption. And yet even that does not make the situation clean, because the rejection does not erase the damage. It does not erase the fact that Catherine had to hear her role described as if it were slipping from her hands. It does not erase that someone, somewhere, helped arm this challenge with insider knowledge. And it certainly does not erase the emotional truth that Meghan likely did not see herself as simply grabbing at something forbidden. She seems to have seen herself as claiming overdue recognition in a system she believed had never fully trusted her. That is what makes this whole thing so messy and so revealing. Both sides can tell themselves a story about injustice. Catherine can say her loyalty was tested at her weakest moment. Meghan can say the institution still protects one kind of royal woman while treating another as permanently suspect. Charles can say he was forced to defend a promise. William can say he was forced to protect his wife. And none of that changes the fact that once the request was made, the illusion of calm family distance was over. The revised charter, the protected language, the closed loophole, all of that matters because it shows the monarchy understood something important. This could not just be denied. It had to be sealed. Because if the palace left even a sliver of interpretive space, the same wound could open again later, whether through Meghan or someone else. Catherine reportedly did not ask for revenge. She asked for protection. That may be the most important detail of all. It tells you that what hurt her most was not simply the personal insult. It was the realization that a vulnerable period in her life had been interpreted as negotiable. And that lands hard because it speaks to a larger fear many people understand. The fear that if you pause, if you weaken, if you step back to survive something difficult, the world will start reassigning your place before you have even had time to stand again. That is why this story resonates beyond royal gossip. It turns a palace conflict into something human. It asks what happens when dignity meets opportunism, when silence is mistaken for absence, and when restraint is misread as surrender. In the end, Charles's decision was not only about Meghan and Catherine. It was about what kind of monarchy he wants to defend. One where sacred trust can be pressured into reallocation, or one where a promise remains a promise even when the person carrying it is forced into temporary shadow. He chose the second path. But the cost of that choice is not small, because every time this family draws a boundary, it also reveals how broken the emotional ground beneath it has become. And that is why this story will linger, not because a patronage was requested and denied, but because it exposed the fault line nobody can fully hide anymore. The fault line between belonging and recognition, between duty and ambition, between the royal woman who became central by staying and the royal woman who believed leaving should not mean losing the chance to shape the future. So the real question is not whether Charles was furious. It is why he had to be pushed to that point at all, why a family already carrying so much fracture reached a moment where one woman's protected role could be treated as another woman's overdue correction, why Catherine's quiet endurance could be interpreted as vacancy, why Meghan still seems, in this story, to be fighting not just for influence, but for acknowledgement that the palace never intended to give her freely. Because once you see all of that, the request stops looking like a one-off outrage and starts looking like a map of the whole monarchy in miniature. The hierarchy, the grievance, the old rules, the modern frustration, the sacred promises, the personal bruises, the desperate need to be seen, the fear of being replaced, the refusal to give way. It is all there. And maybe that is why this landed so heavily, because in the end, the patronage was never just a patronage. It was a symbol, a test, a line in the sand. Charles defended it, Catherine kept it, Meghan lost the bid. But the deeper instability this exposed did not disappear with the refusal. It just slipped back behind the palace walls, where royal tension always goes when the statement has been issued and the cameras move on. Let me know what you think. Was this a calculated overreach by Meghan, or did it expose a deeper truth about how the monarchy decides which women are protected and which ones are kept at the edge of power? Because one thing is certain, this was never only about charity. It was about who gets to define service, who gets to inherit trust, and who the crown still believes truly belongs at its center.